In March of 1978, renovation workers at the abandoned Clearwater Methodist Church in rural Tennessee made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath rotting floorboards in what was once the congregation hall, they found 13 small wooden boxes, each no larger than a shoebox, carefully arranged in a perfect circle. Inside each box, the remains of children, some so young their bones had barely calcified, wrapped in faded baptismal gowns that crumbled at the slightest touch. But it wasn't the bodies that made the workers flee the building and never speak publicly again. It was the photographs tucked beneath each tiny skeleton, wedding portraits showing the same woman, over and over, standing beside different men who all shared her unmistakable facial features. Before we begin, subscribe and let us know in the comments which state you're from. It helps us uncover more of these buried American secrets. The Clearwater Methodist Church had been sealed since 1952, following what local newspapers diplomatically called congregational irregularities. But the real story lay in the handwritten ledger discovered alongside those 13 boxes, a record kept by Reverend Matthias Clearwater, the church's founding minister and patriarch of a family whose name would be systematically erased from Tennessee's official records. The ledger, written in Clearwater's meticulous script, documented something far more disturbing than simple record-keeping. Beginning in 1923, the year he established the church, Reverend Clearwater had been conducting weddings that violated every law of nature and man. The entries read like a fever dream of biblical proportions. United in holy matrimony, Sarah Clearwater, aged 14, to her uncle Thomas Clearwater, aged 34. May their union bear fruit for the glory of the bloodline. United in holy matrimony, Mary Clearwater, a Saint, Jed 16, to her brother James Clearwater, aged 19, third ceremony for Mary. May this union prove more fruitful than her previous marriages to cousins William and Robert. The photographs found with the children's remains began to make horrific sense. Mary Clearwater had indeed been married 3 times, each ceremony performed by her own father, each union producing children who lived only months before succumbing to what the Reverend euphemistically called God's will. But the ledger revealed something even more chilling. Reverend Clearwater hadn't simply been marrying his children to each other. He had been following what he called the sacred mathematics, a breeding program designed to concentrate what he believed were divine gifts within his bloodline, regardless of the cost in human suffering. The Tennessee State Archives, when pressed by investigators in 1978, reluctantly produced additional documentation that painted a picture of systematic horror spanning 3 decades. Census records from 1930 showed the Clearwater compound housed 43 people, all sharing variations of the same surname. But medical examiner files told a different story, one of children born with deformities so severe they couldn't survive outside the womb, of young mothers dying in agony during births that should never have been attempted, of a community willingly sacrificing its future for an obsession with bloodline purity. Dr. Helena Voss, the county medical examiner who had worked in the area during the 1940s, had kept meticulous notes that wouldn't surface until after her death in 1982. Her private journals, discovered by her daughter, documented visits to the Clearwater compound that read like dispatches from hell. Called to the Clearwater property again. 3rd time this month. Another stillbirth. This one so malformed I cannot determine the gender. The mother, Rebecca Clearwater, is barely alive. She tells me this is her 6th pregnancy in 4 years, all by her brother Samuel. Reverend Clearwater stands in the corner muttering prayers and taking notes in that damned ledger of his. He asks me to preserve the remains for future study. I refuse, but I suspect he takes them anyway after I leave. The sacred mathematics, as outlined in Reverend Clearwater's writings, operated on a twisted interpretation of Genesis. He believed that before the Great Flood, humanity possessed divine attributes that were diluted through intermarriage with lesser bloodlines. By carefully controlling reproduction within his family, he intended to reconcentrate these gifts, creating children with supernatural abilities. The reality was far more grotesque. Medical records smuggled out by a hote, A Riverside County nurse in 1951 documented children born without eyes, others with limbs fused together, infants whose skulls never properly formed. But Reverend Clearwater saw each deformity as progress, each death as a necessary sacrifice on the path to perfection. What the authorities discovered next would force them to seal the case forever. Hidden beneath the church altar, investigators found what Reverend Clearwater called his breeding logs, detailed records spanning 29 years that documented every pregnancy, every birth, every death within his controlled community. The logs were written in multiple hands, suggesting that the practice had been institutionalized, with family members required to document their own pregnancies and those of their relatives. The entries became increasingly desperate as the years progressed. Generation 4, attempt 17, sister wife. Martha delivered twins. Male infant survived 6 days before succumbing to breathing difficulties. Female infant shows promise. All limbs present, appears to possess enhanced sensory capabilities. Father-husband David notes unusual eye coloration. Will monitor closely. Generation 5, attempt 43, cousin wives. Sarah and Rebecca both delivered within days of each other. Both infants born with severe cranial malformations. Sarah's child possessed extra digits on both hands, possible sign of divine favor. Father-Uncle Matthias Jr. believes we are approaching breakthrough. Death not failure, but refinement. FBI agent Caroline Morrison, who investigated the case as part of a larger probe into religious extremist groups, later described the logs as the most systematic documentation of human horror I encountered in 30 years of federal service. But what disturbed Morrison most wasn't the clinical language used to describe unspeakable suffering. It was the evidence that the breeding program had been expanding. Scattered throughout the logs were references to branch families, Clearwater relatives who had established similar communities in Kentucky, Georgia, and Alabama. Each branch maintained correspondence with the Tennessee compound, sharing research findings and occasionally exchanging family members to introduce fresh blood while maintaining the concentrated bloodline. Morrison's team identified at least 7 such communities, each centered around a Methodist church, each led by a Clearwater family member, each operating according to the sacred mathematics. But when federal agents arrived at these locations in late 1978, they found only abandoned buildings and hastily filled graves. The branch families had vanished as if they never existed, leaving behind only architectural evidence of their present. Say, houses with too many bedrooms, churches with altars designed for multiple simultaneous ceremonies, and basements that showed signs of hasty concrete work. What happened to the branch families might have remained a mystery forever, if not for the discovery of Agent Morrison's classified files following her death in 2003. Her personal notes marked, "Do not include an official report," revealed that the FBI's investigation had uncovered evidence of something far more disturbing than isolated religious extremism. The Clearwater breeding program hadn't been developed in a vacuum. Morrison's files contained correspondence between Reverend Clearwater and researchers at prominent American universities, geneticists, anthropologists, and physicians who had been quietly observing and sometimes directing the family's experiments for decades. Dr. Edmund Hartwell of Johns Hopkins University had been particularly active, providing medical equipment and guidance through carefully coded letters that discussed livestock breeding techniques and agricultural improvements. But Morrison's decoded translations revealed the true nature of these communications. The latest specimens show remarkable progress. Skeletal density in Generation 5 subjects exceeds normal parameters by 23%. Nervous system anomalies suggest heightened sensory capacity. Recommend continuing current breeding protocols while introducing subject Group C genetic material from our Kentucky associates. Regret to inform you that Washington oversight is increasing. Suggest moving active research to more remote facilities. Have identified suitable location in Montana. Will arrange discreet relocation of most promising breeding pairs. The files suggested that the Clearwater family had been part of a larger network of human experimentation, one that operated under the cover of religious extremism while pursuing what the researchers called evolutionary acceleration. The branch families hadn't simply disappeared. They had been relocated to continue their work away from federal scrutiny. Morrison's notes ended abruptly in 1982, 4 years after the initial investigation. Her final entry read simply, "They know I know, requesting immediate transfer. If something happens to me, check the Montana mining records. Look for Hartwell Foundation purchases, 1978 to 1980. But by the time Morrison's files were discovered, any trace of Hartwell Foundation activity had been systematically erased from public records. The official investigation into the Clearwater compound concluded in December 1978 with a report that sanitized every disturbing detail. According to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, authorities had discovered evidence of minor regulatory violations at an abandoned religious facility. The 13 children's remains were attributed to historical infant mortality typical of isolated rural communities. No mention was made of the wedding photographs, the breeding logs, or the branch family network. The church was demolished in early 1979 with the Tennessee Department of Transportation citing structural concerns as justification for immediately paving the site as part of a new highway project. But locals in the area began noticing changes that couldn't be explained by official reports. Families that had lived in the region for generations started receiving unexpected offers to sell their property, offers that came with subtle suggestions about the wisdom of relocating elsewhere. Those who refused found themselves facing mysterious problems. Wells contaminated overnight, livestock dying without explanation, children developing unusual health issues that required treatment far from local hospitals. Martha Henley, whose family had farmed near the Clearwater compound for 4 generations, later described the systematic pressure. "They never threatened us directly, but every month brought some new problem, some new reason why staying wasn't safe anymore. My youngest daughter started having seizures that only happened when she was on our property. The specialists in Nashville said it was environmental, but they couldn't identify any specific cause. We sold the farm in 1982 and never looked back." Property records show that between 1979 and 1985, every farm within a 5-mile radius of the former Clearwater compound changed hands. The buyers were invariably represented by the same law firm, Hartwell, Morrison Associates, though no connection to Dr. Edmund Hartwell was ever officially established. The new owners never developed the land. Instead, they installed sophisticated fencing and hired private security firms to patrol the area. Satellite imagery from the 1990s shows the construction of several large windowless buildings deep within the property, connected by underground tunnels that don't appear on any public utility maps. What makes the Clearwater case truly disturbing isn't what was discovered in 1978, but what was never found. According to the breeding logs, the compound should have housed dozens of children and young adults at the time of its abandonment in 1952. Yet only 13 sets of remains were recovered from beneath the church floor. FBI agent Morrison's classified notes contained a chilling theory about the missing Clearwater descendants. Her investigation had identified over 40 individuals who should have been alive when the compound was sealed. Children and teenagers who had been born into the breeding program but had somehow vanished without a trace. Morrison believed these missing individuals hadn't died at the compound. Instead, they had been relocated as part of what she called Phase 2 of the breeding program. Her files contained fragments of evidence suggesting that the most successful products of the sacred mathematics had been moved to different facilities, where their unique genetic characteristics could be studied and potentially replicated on a larger scale. A 1979 memo from Morrison to her FBI supervisors outlined her suspicions. The Clearwater compound appears to have been a proving ground rather than the primary facility. Medical records suggest that subjects showing desired genetic anomalies were systematically transferred elsewhere beginning in 1948. Recommend expanded investigation to locate these individuals and determine current status. The memo was marked "Investigation terminated by order of Deputy Director" and filed without action. But Morrison hadn't given up. Her personal notes from the early 1980s documented her off-duty investigation into what she called the generation that never was, the 40-plus Clearwater descendants who had simply vanished from all official records. Using unofficial channels, Morrison traced fragmented evidence of these individuals to locations across the American West. Mental hospitals in Nevada had admitted patients with unusual physical characteristics and no verifiable identities during the 1950s. Military research facilities in New Mexico had employed civilian subjects for classified medical studies during the same period. Private medical facilities in Colorado had treated patients with rare genetic conditions that perfectly matched the abnormalities documented in the Clearwater breeding logs. Morrison's investigation suggested that rather than ending with the closure of the Tennessee compound, the Clearwater breeding program had evolved into something far more sophisticated and widespread. Morrison's files contained one final revelation that her superiors had worked desperately to suppress. In 1981, she had discovered evidence that the Clearwater genetic material was still being actively studied and potentially used in contemporary research programs. Through a contact at the Centers for Disease Control, Morrison learned that genetic samples of unknown origin had been distributed to research institutions across the country during the 1970s and 1980s. These samples exhibited unusual characteristics that made them valuable for studying human genetic variation and potential enhancement. The samples were identified only by code numbers that Morrison traced back to the original Clearwater breeding logs. The most successful subjects from the Tennessee compound, those who had survived birth and shown the genetic anomalies that Reverend Clearwater had sought to cultivate, had become the foundation for decades of genetic research. Morrison's final report, never submitted to her superiors, concluded that the Clearwater breeding program hadn't been terminated in 1978. Instead, it had been absorbed into legitimate scientific research, where the techniques developed through generations of human suffering could be refined and applied on a scale that the Reverend could never have imagined. Her investigation had uncovered correspondence between former Clearwater researchers and prominent geneticists working on early human genome projects. The language was carefully clinical, but Morrison recognized the underlying philosophy, the same obsession with genetic improvement that had driven Reverend Clearwater's sacred mathematics, now cloaked in academic respectability and government funding. The final entry in Morrison's files, dated just weeks before her mysterious death in 2003, read, "They succeeded. Everything Clearwater dreamed of, they've accomplished through legitimate channels. The breeding program never ended. It just got better funding and more sophisticated methods. God help us all." In 2019, renovation work on the former Hartwell Foundation property in Montana, the same location referenced in Agent Morrison's final notes, uncovered evidence that the Clearwater legacy had continued well into the 21st century. Workers demolishing what they believed was an abandoned research facility found laboratories equipped with genetic sequencing equipment, storage facilities containing thousands of biological samples, and living quarters designed to house subjects for extended periods. Most disturbing were the medical records discovered in a fireproof vault beneath the main building. These files documented ongoing research involving subjects identified only by number codes that matched those in Morrison's FBI files. The records indicated that descendants of the original Clearwater breeding program had been tracked, studied, and in some cases recruited for continued research well into the 2010s. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic investigator who examined the Montana facility, later described the discovery as the most comprehensive documentation of multi-generational human experimentation ever uncovered on American soil. But like the FBI investigation 40 years earlier, Chen's findings were quickly classified and removed from public access. The Montana discovery might have remained secret forever, if not for a leak by one of Chen's research assistants. The leaked documents revealed that genetic material from the Clearwater bloodline had been incorporated into commercial genetic research, fertility treatments, and even military enhancement programs. Companies offering designer baby services, genetic optimization therapy, and hereditary disease prevention had unknowingly built their technologies on foundations laid by Reverend Clearwater's sacred mathematics. The suffering of generations of isolated Tennessee families had become the building blocks for a multi-billion-dollar industry, promising to perfect human genetics. The assistant who leaked the documents disappeared 3 days after their release online. The documents themselves were removed from every platform within hours, dismissed by official sources as sophisticated disinformation designed to discredit legitimate genetic research. But archived copies of the leaked files continue to circulate in dark corners of the internet, where researchers and conspiracy theorists work to verify their authenticity and implications. What makes the Clearwater story truly terrifying isn't the historical horror of the breeding program. It's the possibility that it never really ended. Evidence suggests that the genetic legacy of Reverend Clearwater's experiments continues to influence American society in ways that most people will never recognize. Genealogical research conducted by independent investigators has identified over 3,000 Americans who carry genetic markers consistent with the Clearwater bloodline. Many of these individuals exhibit unusual physical and cognitive characteristics, enhanced sensory perception, unusual disease resistance, and cognitive abilities that fall outside normal parameters. These descendants live normal lives, unaware of their connection to one of America's darkest experiments. They work as teachers, engineers, doctors, and politicians. Some have risen to positions of significant influence in government, academia, and industry. Their success isn't coincidental. It's the culmination of a breeding program designed to create superior human beings, regardless of the cost in human suffering. More disturbing is evidence that these descendants continue to be monitored and occasionally contacted by organizations with unclear motives. Several have reported receiving unsolicited genetic testing kits, invitations to participate in exclusive research programs, or job offers from companies with connections to the original Clearwater Research Network. The monitoring appears to be systematic and ongoing. Genetic counselors in major medical centers have reported unusual interest in clients who carry specific genetic markers. Military recruiters have shown particular attention to young people with family histories that trace back to the Tennessee and Kentucky regions where Clearwater compounds operated. The pattern suggests that the Clearwater experiment never ended. It simply evolved into something more sophisticated and widespread than Reverend Clearwater could have imagined. The most disturbing aspect of the Clearwater story isn't what happened in those isolated compounds. It's how successfully the truth has been suppressed and sanitized. Despite decades of documentation by FBI agents, medical examiners, and independent researchers, the story remains unknown to the vast majority of Americans. This silence isn't accidental. It's the result of systematic efforts by government agencies, research institutions, and private organizations to prevent public awareness of how far American authorities were willing to go in pursuit of genetic improvement. The Clearwater case represents just one example of human experimentation that continued well beyond what most people believe possible in modern America. The families whose suffering made this research possible have been erased from public memory. Their names appear in no history books. Their graves bear no monuments. Their children's voices echo only in classified files that may never see daylight. They became willing participants in their own destruction, convinced by religious authority that their sacrifice served a divine purpose. But the real tragedy isn't what happened to the Clearwater families. It's what their suffering enabled. Every advance in genetic medicine, every breakthrough in hereditary disease treatment, every promise of human genetic enhancement carry as traces of knowledge purchased with the lives of children who never had a choice. The beneficiaries of this research live comfortable lives, unaware that their medical treatments and genetic therapies were built on foundations of systematic horror. They celebrate scientific progress while remaining ignorant of the human cost that made it possible. This ignorance isn't accidental. It's carefully maintained through the systematic suppression of information, the classification of evidence, and the marginalization of anyone who attempts to expose the truth. The American silence surrounding the Clearwater case represents more than simple cover-up. It reveals a national willingness to forget inconvenient truths, to sacrifice historical accuracy for contemporary comfort, and to allow the repetition of past horrors through willful ignorance. Today, the site of the original Clearwater Methodist Church lies beneath 4 lanes of Tennessee Highway, unmarked and unremembered. Thousands of drivers pass over those 13 children's graves every day, unaware that their daily commute crosses ground soaked in suffering that most Americans have chosen to forget. But in the backwoods communities where the Clearwater compounds once operated, older residents still speak in whispers about the families who disappeared overnight, about children who were never quite right, about bloodlines that carried curses disguised as blessings. They remember because forgetting would be an even greater sin than the silence that allowed such horrors to flourish. The genetic material that Reverend Clearwater spent 30 years refining through systematic horror continues to flow through American bloodlines, creating abilities and anomalies that its carriers will never understand. His sacred mathematics succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, not through divine intervention, but through the cold calculation of researchers who transformed religious madness into scientific progress. America chose not to remember the Clearwater story, because remembering would force an acknowledgement that the line between civilization and barbarism is far thinner than most people can bear to admit. In the end, the greatest horror isn't what happened in those isolated compounds. It's how easily a nation convinced itself that it never happened at all. The floorboards have been paved over, but the silence remains, deeper and more absolute than any grave.